Hello beading friends, I'm Melissa Grakowski-Shippey. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to make these earrings, which I call Laurel earrings. They're made using a combination of off-loom bead weaving techniques, including peyote stitch, netting, and right angle weave. This project is great whether you're a beginner or a more intermediate level beader with some experience.
To work this project, you're going to need up to 2 grams of size 11/0 seed bead. I used Miyuki 954. Up to 2 grams of a size 11/0 cylinder bead. I used Miyuki Delica number 29. You're also going to need up to 2 grams of 2 different colors of size 15/0 seed beads. For my 15A, I used Toho 711. For my 15B, I used Toho 995F. You're going to need 2 8mm pearls. For my project, I used Swarovski Vintage Gold pearls. You're going to need 2 6mm fire polished beads. I used these pale Pacific blue ones. You're going to need 12 3mm fire polished beads, and these are just gold plated. You're going to need 2 30mm pendants. These are Swarovski crystallactite pendants in Golden Shadow. In one of the other versions of the kit, I used 30mm Swarovski ellipse pendants in light Colorado topaz. You're also going to need 2 18mm cabochons. I used these 18mm check cabochons. You can also use 18mm check buttons. And the color of these are medium sky blue with gold accents, and the pattern is a Laurel pattern. You're also going to need 2 ear wires. I used Tierra cast niobium ear wires in an antique bronze color.
To work this project, you're going to need, in addition to the beads, a bead mat or bead on it board, beading thread, beading needles in size 11 to 12, a triangle or some other tool you can use to clean up the beads, and some scissors.
The 3 main parts of the project are the bezel, the crescent component, and the pearl component. We're going to start with the bezel. To start your bezel, string up 46 cylinders. Stitch through the first few beads again in a circular fashion to form a loop. Bring your loop down toward the end of your thread, leaving just enough of a tail to weave into the beadwork later and trim, and to hold on to while you work. I like to wrap it around my fingers in my left hand while I stitch with my right hand. Peyote stitch a round of cylinders by picking up one cylinder, skipping over the next bead in the ring, and stitching through the one after that. And then just repeating that stitch all the way around. Pick up a cylinder, skip over the next cylinder, and stitch through the one after that. Work your way all the way around the ring. When you get to the end of the round, pick up your final cylinder to peyote stitch. Skip the next bead, stitch through the one after that, and then step up through the first bead you added in the previous row of peyote stitch, or in the row you're just finishing. This puts your thread in place for the next round. Peyote stitch one round of 15 beads by picking up a bead and stitching through the next up bead, which is a bead you added in the previous round. Work your way all the way around. As you add the last bead in the round, step up through the first 15B added. Pull your thread tight so the beads start to cup in to hold your cabochon in place. Then peyote stitch 2 rounds of 15 A's, stepping up at the end of each round. At any point when you're working, you can go ahead and weave in, secure, and trim your tail thread to get it out of the way. After adding the last bead in the second round of 15 A's, you don't have to step up. You can if you like. But either way, once you have added that bead, weave down through the beads in a stepwise manner so that you're heading toward the bottom or the outside row of cylinder beads. And bring your thread out of one of those beads in that row. So you've just completed the front side of the bezel. The button is going to fit in place like that. Front side of the button against the beads, the rows you just finished. Button or cabochon. In this video I'm showing you the button version, but there's also a cabochon version. Same size, 18 millimeters. So now you're going to work the back side, and you can hold your cabochon or your button in place while you work, or choose to add it in later after you've added some of the beads in the first row. The first row itself won't hold the cabochon or button in place. You're going to need to add a few rows. Peyote stitch 3 rows using your 15 B's. And make sure you step up at the end of each of these rows. After adding the 3 rounds of 15 B's in peyote stitch, normally you're going to add a round where you skip every other space. So pick up a 15 B and peyote stitch it in the space. Then step down through the next bead, which is actually 2 rows back. So just stitch through the bead that's a little lower. Then stitch through the next up bead. So you've essentially added a bead in a space and then skipped a space, not adding a bead there. You're going to repeat that process all the way around. So peyote stitch a bead, then skip a space. When you get to the end of the row, you'll find that you're going to add a bead, and then after skipping the next space, you're going to have one more space before that first 15 B you added in this row, and you're going to skip that space as well. So after adding the final bead, you're going to skip 2 spaces and step up through the first bead added in this 4th row of 15 O's. Pick up 2 cylinders and stitch through the next bead added in this row. So this is sort of like a peyote stitch decrease. There's 3 15 B's with 2 cylinders over them in that space. Repeat that all the way around until you get to the last space, which is a little bit bigger than all of the other spaces. When you get to that last space, which is bigger than the others, pick up 3 cylinders and stitch through the first 15 B in the previous row. So now when you pull tight, this row really helps cinch in the back of the bezel. So that's the final row of the bezel. From there, if you have enough thread, you can weave through the beadwork and bring your thread out of a cylinder bead in the center round of cylinders. You have 3 rounds, so look for a bead in the center. Now this is where you can add the loop for the ear wire. Pick up 5 15As and stitch through the bottom loop of the ear wire, making sure it's oriented correctly, and then stitch through the same cylinder in the bezel again in a circular fashion. Oops. If your ear wire comes off of your loop of beads like this, it's got a pretty big gap. You can just hook that back onto the thread and then tighten it up. And then go ahead and reinforce that thread path through those 5 beads at least once before you weave in, secure, and trim your working thread. After adding the loop for the ear wire, weave over so your thread is coming out of the 4th center row cylinder bead from the one that your loop is attached to. So the ear wire loop's on bead number 1, then there's bead number 2, number 3, number 4. Bring your thread out of number 4, pick up an 11-0, and stitch through the next bead in the center round to add that 11-0 in the ditch. Repeat that 5 times for a total of 6. Then weave through to the 6th cylinder in the center round from where the last 11-0 is attached. So if the last 11-0 is attached to this bead here, that's number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Stitch 6 11-0s in the next 6 stitches. Now make sure that your cabochon bezel is symmetrical. Make sure that the flower button or the Laurel button is oriented the way that you want it. Otherwise, rotate it in the bezel. And then weave in, secure, and trim your working thread. To make the crescent component, needle up a half wingspan of thread and pick up 4 11-0s. Bring them down toward the end of the thread, leaving just enough of a thread to hold on to while you work. Stitch through the first 11-0 again in a circular fashion to form a loop. And bring that little guy down. I have just enough thread now to hold on to while I work. Pick up 3 11-0s and stitch through the 11-0 that your thread is coming out of in a circular fashion. So you're not stitching into the same side your thread is coming out of, you're stitching into the other side of the bead. And what you're doing is forming a little right angle weave unit. So you have 2 little right angle weave units now. Stitch through the next 11-0 in the unit you just formed, and then 1 more. pick up 3 11-ohs, stitch through the 11-oh that your thread is coming out of, again in a circular fashion, to form a third right angle weave unit, then stitch through the next 2 beads in the unit. And continue in this fashion until you have a total of 7 right angle weave units. When you add the 7th unit, don't stitch through 2 more beads, just stitch through 1 more. Then pick up a cylinder and stitch through the next bead. Pick up a cylinder and stitch through the next bead. Now working down along the edge of the strip of right angle weave, pick up a cylinder and stitch through the next 11-oh on the edge. Just repeat that all the way down. Don't worry about if your right angle weave units are wonky, they will get straightened out by this process. And you want your thread tension in this part to be sort of medium. You don't want to pull too tight. You want to be able to stitch through these cylinders in the next step, so you want to leave a tiny bit of slack in the thread. Alright, once you get down to the other end, pick up a cylinder and stitch through that end 11-oh. And pick up a cylinder and stitch through the next 11-oh on that next edge. Then start adding cylinders along this edge of the right angle weave strip. After adding that last cylinder, stitch through that first cylinder added, then the next 11-oh, and then the next cylinder. Pick up 3 15-A's and stitch through the next cylinder. Repeat that all along this edge of the strip. And again, it's okay if the beads don't sit all in a line. You're going to use them in the next step, and they'll get straightened out then. After adding the last group of 3 15-O's along that edge, stitch through the next 11-O on the end and then the next cylinder. And then repeat the same process as you did for the first edge, adding 3 15-O's between each of the cylinders along this edge. 3 15-A's. After adding the last group of 3 15-A's, stitch through the 11-O on the end, the next cylinder, and then step up through the first 2 15-A's added on the first side. Now working along this edge, pick up a 3mm fire polish bead and stitch through the middle 15A in the next group of 3. And then repeat that 5 more times to add a total of 6. So I've got 6. I'm at the edge, or the end rather, of my strip. Stitch through the next 15A in the group of 3, then the next cylinder, then the next 11O cylinder, and first 2 15As in the next group of 3. And pull tight so that there's not slack between the 3mm fire polish beads and the 15Os. And then bring them all to the same side of the strip, kind of working this shape into a crescent shape. And now bring your other edge of 15Os up toward the 3mm fire polish beads by kind of pinching the 2 edges together. This is my tail thread here. It's going to kind of be in the way. So I'm going to pass it through one of these right angle weave units to the other side so I can worry about it later. Alright, so now starting in the middle 15A in this first group of 3, stitch through the first 3mm fire polish bead as you're working toward the other end of the strip. Then stitch through the next 15A, the middle 15A in the next group of 3. Then stitch through the next 3mm fire polish bead. Then stitch through the next middle 15A, then through the next fire polish bead. So you're zipping the 2 sides together, and just keep going with this process till you get to the other end. So now you should have a fully zipped little crescent shaped piece of beadwork. Reverse direction and stitch through the middle 15A in the group of 3 opposite the one your thread is coming out of on the end. Then stitch back through that last fire polish bead. Pick up an 11O and stitch through the next 3mm fire polish bead. And repeat that all the way down the strip. When you get to the end, reverse direction and stitch through that first 15A opposite the one your thread was coming out of, and then just retrace that thread path. Now you're going to pause your thread coming out of that middle 11O between 3mm fire polish beads only if you're not using your working thread to attach the 6mm fire polish bead into the center of the crescent. If you are using it, you're going to need to keep going and then work your way to the place where you add the 6mm fire polish. But if you have enough tail thread, you can needle up your tail thread from where you left it hanging, which should be coming out of the second 11O from the end on the inside of the right angle weave strip in the center, and pick up a 6mm fire polish bead. Then stitch through the opposite 11O, the second one from the other end of the right angle weave strip. stitch back through the 6mm fire polish bead and then through that first 11-0 again. Stitch through the 6mm fire polish again so you can repeat the thread path at least once through the 11-0 on the other side, back through the 6mm fire polish bead and into that 11-0 on the first side. And then if this is your tail thread, weave in, secure, and trim your thread. Otherwise, if it's the working thread, you're going to weave back to the middle 11-0 between 3mm fire polish beads on the outside edge, and leave that thread hanging for now for assembly. To work the pearl component, needle up about 1 yard of thread and stitch through one of the 8mm pearls, leaving enough thread to hold on to with your fingers while you work and to weave in, secure, and trim in the beadwork later. Pick up one 11-0 and stitch back through the pearl. Pick up another 11-0 and stitch back through the pearl. Pull your working thread and your tail thread in opposite directions to really tighten it up. Then stitch through the first 11-0 again, through the pearl again, and the second 11-0 again. Pick up 9 11-0s and stitch through the second 11-0, and then repeat that. Pick up 9 11-0s, and stitch through that first 11-0 so that you then have a continuous line of beads around the pearl. Now start peyote stitching by picking up an 11-0, skipping the next 11-0, and stitching through the one after that. The beads aren't going to sit as nicely as cylinder beads do on each other, but don't worry if your peyote stitch is a little funky because it'll straighten out as you add subsequent rows. Once you've worked all the way around, step up through the first 11-0 added in peyote stitch. Then pick up a cylinder and stitch through the next 11-0. Repeat that all the way around. After adding the last cylinder, step up through the first cylinder added. Then peyote stitch one round of 15 A's. After adding the last 15A, you don't have to step up. You can if you want to, but just pull real tight so that this sort of forms a bezel around the pearl. Then weave through the next 3 11-0s to the opposite edge and repeat the round of cylinders in peyote stitch and then the round of 15 A's. When you reach the end of the row of 15As, do not step up, so your thread should be emerging from a cylinder. Note which direction you're coming out of the cylinder. Now as I'm holding this, I'm coming down out of the bead. Pick up 13 15As and stitch through the whole of the crystal pendant. It's going to either be a crystal stalactite pendant or crystallactite pendant like this one, or an ellipse pendant, both Swarovski. Stitch through the cylinder bead opposite the first and stitch into it in the opposite direction that the thread is coming out of the first one. So in the first one, my thread's coming down out of it, I'm stitching up into the second one. Now I picked up 13 beads here. You may find you need 15 beads if you're using Miyuki beads. These are Toho beads, so they're a little bigger, but after you do this next part, you'll be able to tell if it's too few beads or not. Pick up 4 15As, skip the last 4 15As in the group of 13 and stitch through the next 5. Then pick up 4 15As and stitch through the first cylinder again. So in the direction that you passed through last time. So your thread will be going into the side opposite where the first thread was coming out. And tighten all this up. You may need to sort of pull each segment to tighten it up individually. Now this hangs the pendant just in the dead center of this component so that everything hangs evenly on your ear. So just go ahead and retrace the thread path and then weave in, secure, and trim any threads you have hanging. To begin the assembly process, needle up the hanging thread on your crescent component, which should be coming out of the middle 11-0 between fire polish beads. Pick up 2 15As and stitch through the center cylinder bead on your pearl component directly opposite where the pendant is hanging. And make sure you've stitched through it so that your 11-0 on your crescent component is going to line up directly with that bead. Pick up 2 more 15As and stitch through the middle 11-0 on the crescent component again. Now turn the beadwork over so you're looking at the other side of the pearl component. Pick up 2 15As, stitch through the cylinder lined up with the first one on sort of the top center of the component, opposite where the crystal pendant is hanging. Pick up 2 more 15As and stitch through the 11-0 between 3mm fire polish on the crescent component again. Pull that tight. So now you should have 2 pairs of 15As on one side and 2 pairs of 15As on the other side. That centers the crescent component and its connection to the pearl component. So then go ahead and retrace those thread paths to reinforce everything. And then do not trim this thread yet. You're going to need it for the next part of the assembly process as well. Once you've reinforced those thread paths, you're going to stitch through the 3mm fire polish and 11-0s on the crescent component, working your way toward the end of the right angle weave strip. bring your thread out of the first cylinder on the corner of the right angle weave strip. So you're coming out of one headed toward the other one on the end, around the corner. Now pick up the cabochon bezel and locate the pair of cylinders one bead away from an 11-0 that you stitched in the ditch. What's going to happen is these two cylinders on the end of the raw strip are going to line up with those two cylinders that are one cylinder away from the 11-0. And I'm coming out of the one that's on the left hand side as I'm looking at this. So I'm going to stitch into the left hand cylinder toward the 11-0. Then I'm going to reverse direction and stitch through the adjacent cylinder. And be careful my thread doesn't get caught around the 11-0, which is very easy to do. Okay, pull tight. And then I'm going to stitch into that second cylinder on the end of the raw strip. Alright, now I'm going to work my way around this raw unit from sort of the inside, so I can come back through that first cylinder and retrace the thread path into the cabochon bezel again. After securing that first connection with a couple more passes of thread, I'm going to work my way over to the other end of the raw strip to make the same connection with the other side of the cabochon bezel. And I like to do this by working through the outside edge of the crescent component because there's more room in those 3mm fire polish beads and 11-0s usually than the beads on the inside of the raw strip, which have been stitched through a lot at this point. Plus this helps reinforce the connection to the pearl component. Well, it's still pretty tight in there. You need to use pliers. I'm also using my thread as a Nymo D from the large spools, which is a bit thicker than the Nymo D on the small spools, and it can be a challenge sometimes because it does fill up bead holes faster than the Nymo on the small spools or Toho 1G or Hana beading thread, which are some of my faves for nylon thread. Alright, so now I'm coming out of the left-hand cylinder. I'm going to look for the pair of cylinders that are one cylinder away from the 11-0 here. I'm going to stitch through the left-hand one toward the 11-0, then reverse direction and stitch through the adjacent one. And then stitch through that second cylinder on the end of the raw strip. And then I'll retrace my thread path. I'm actually going to do a little cheat retrace thread path thing where I go down through these two 15-0s and then just reverse direction through the adjacent two 15-0s. It's going to be easier than going through the beads in the raw strip again. Alright, and now that thread path is reinforced, so I can weave in, secure, and trim my thread, and my earring is done.
Alright, one more time. So,
Oh, hello.
That's ridiculous. Wait, did you start it? Stop.
What?
Alright.
Ready?
Start. That was bad.
Okay.
Hold on. Okay.
It's probably enough crap to take a couple seconds from.